I want to just talk briefly on a topic attribution that's been on my mind a lot. For those of you who know, I've been donating more of my time to Homeland Security in the U.S., and so I spend time, and I've just recently spent a week wandering around D.C. listening to what everybody has to say and what's interesting. And the funny thing is, the topic that comes up over and over is this concept of attribution, which is not a concept we have a whole lot in my hacker world. I mean, yes, you want to avoid attribution and not be caught. But it's not something that a lot of people worry about. I think it's you defend your networks, you try not to get broken into, and then you move on with making money or your job. But to governments, they're really concerned about this concept of attribution because you can't have deterrence without attribution. And our whole sort of defensive posture is based on this concept of deterrence. So you have all these people inventing all these kind of obtuse systems to try to automatically identify and attribute attacks, right? Well, we saw the packet come in from here, and then the packet came in from there, and then the browser string was in this, foreign language, and then they're probably from that country. It's like, okay, yeah, probably they are, but, you're not going to launch missiles based on that information. This concept of evading identification is super old in the hacker games. I mean, how many people here remember chaining together so many systems until your telnet session was like ka-chunk, ka-chunk, like 4 seconds, it's like 3,000 milliseconds of lag between each character on your SSH session. It's like, oh, I chained myself through one too many countries. I better back out. It's a little too slow when your shell session is that slow. But thanks to the high-speed internet nowadays, you can chain through ever more systems, right? You can bounce through 5, 6 machines and probably not notice a whole lot. And you can do them between countries that hate each other and will never pick up the phone and talk to each other. And that gives you a lot of ability to hide. And so the limiting factor is almost a technology one. It's network latency. And because of this, technical attribution, at least in my perspective, is essentially impossible. Because clever adversaries know this. Now, of course, you can catch the low-hanging fruit and the dummies. But clever attribution, it's going to be very hard on a purely technical level, I believe, to attribute an attack. And so, just like in the spy versus spy world of the Cold War, right, you have false flags and misdirection. You have people that plant evidence and implicate innocent people. You're going to have the same problems with purely technical attribution. And so I'm saying that we have to learn to live in that world. You're going to have to live in a world where you can't hit a button and say, aha, I'm going to strike back to this IP address because it's clearly that country that's attacking me. And the State Department can't clearly look at these statistics and say, aha, Estonia, they're after us. It's like, no, it's probably not going to be that clear. So we need to develop systems to deal with that reality, and they're not going to be easy systems. They're going to be things like better treaties, better working relationships with other network security teams in different countries. It's going to be a whole lot of traditional gumshoe detective work, right? It's like, well, we think we're being attacked from this country. Well, let's get some agents in there and spy on them. Okay, we think it's coming from the university. Okay, well, we should look at the university and watch what building it is coming from. Who's coming in and out of that building? Do the attacks stop when the lights go off? Do the attacks start when the lights come on? Then they're probably in that building. We're going to have to get better at connecting all the dots because a purely technical solution, I don't think, is the way that you can create policy in the future. But this also gives us a certain level of deniability, right? We are not 100% sure of who they are. Well, they can't be 100% sure of who we are. And that works both ways in law enforcement and the intelligence community, because that allows us a certain amount of latitude to monkey around and try to get at them. It's not a one-way street, right? We can use this to our advantage right now. So don't give up, don't despair. It's not all one-sided, but you have to be aware of it and take advantage. Okay, so that's kind of all I want to say right now on attribution, because we're actually going to hear something far cooler from Max Kelly. So Max was in the FBI, and he was working in the as in Macintosh and Unix forensics labs at headquarters at FBI in Washington, D.C. But in 2005, he got struck with the bug and wanted to leave and do something more entrepreneurial and something more commercial. And he ended up being wooed away and started the security team at Facebook in 2005. And he's built and run it ever since. And it's a really interesting challenge because you're constantly having to respond to every single changing threat that you can find on the internet. And during that time, Facebook has grown, I don't know how many thousands of %. And the people coming after you are like application scammers, spammers trying to get at your customer base, and all kinds of miscreants who stay up all night long trying to figure out ways to misuse the Facebook platform for whatever their ends are. And so he's got to figure out how to do defense against these kinds of attacks, essentially in real time with machine learning. And the other interesting thing is it's led to this philosophy, the sort of the Facebook development philosophy is how do you do this in a high growth, rapid development environment when the attacks are constantly escalating, and you're in the fastest development environment or one of them in the world. So certain concepts that you've grown to love, you can't do in that environment. And so that's led to this sort of unique philosophy Max has developed and will share with you, which I think is pretty cool. But before you get up, one of the cool things about knowing Max, though, is he works at Facebook, and you get to ask him questions about Facebook. And I recently started trying to use Facebook more, and I'm like, well, who are all these people friending me? How do you select who you friend? Like, is there a threshold? Do you guys have, like, some weird metric that you use? They have to know 10 of your buddies or whatever? And I'm like, how does this work? So I asked Max, I said, everybody in the world must want to be your friend. I mean, maybe, you're not as, you're not as cute as maybe, I don't know, the other Zuckerberg. She has, like, thousands of friends. But you have lots of friends. And Max has this philosophy, which is, I won't friend anybody unless I've physically met them twice. Because you meet a lot of people one time in your life, but you don't necessarily meet a lot of people twice, especially at conferences. And you have to actually remember them. And that seems like a pretty relevant threshold, right? I'm not looking for my next best friend. I'm just looking for people who are interested in the same things I am, that are humans and not robots. So anyway, with that, I'm going to pass it off to Max, who's going to give you a really cool insight into life at Facebook, and I think a glimpse into the future of how you're going to have to develop and defend these high-volume social sites. So, cool. Thanks, Max.
Thanks. Give you this one back. Well, thanks everyone for coming out, and good morning, and I guess welcome to Barcelona if you're not from here, and if you are, thanks for coming. Interestingly, I think one of you'll be able to tell during my presentation that Jeff and I didn't coordinate notes with his comments and what I'm about to say, because in a nutshell, I'm going to talk about how important it is to build attribution into your site and your security philosophy. So keep that in mind as we go forward. When they asked me to come speak here, I was thinking a lot about what the right things to speak about were at Black Hat, because it's very much focused on technical issues, how to, getting into the dirt, seeing the techniques and working on them. And I thought a lot of the ones that we use at Facebook are either very, very specific to Facebook and our environment, or they're things that I don't necessarily want to tell people about because they're really important to how we keep things safe. So I thought what I can do is actually go up to the next step and say, for all these tools and techniques that I'll hint about during this presentation, there is a unifying philosophy and way that we thought about approaching security as we were building this company up at rapid velocity that will intuit to you, if you fill in the gaps, the types of things that we're doing. And I have some case studies, some other cases that we worked on that I'll talk about that I'm not sure how much detail we've actually ever said in public before, so you'll probably learn something there. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is just directly kind of from the Facebook standpoint, where our values came from, what formed them early on in the early life of the company, and what they are. Kind of our view of the world and how we view attacks against us and how we deal with that. A little bit about spam and how we had some big anti-spam cases in the U.S., and I'll talk about how we created those and what they actually were. And then I'll revisit what I said, because it's always important to say things twice, sometimes three times. And I always like to have a small Q&A session at the end, because if people always want to ask me questions, and I love to answer them. And actually, you can ask anything you want, Facebook or not. I have a little bit of a cough, so excuse me for that. So let's talk about some of the values. I don't know if you've seen the movie Zombieland, but the main character has these rules that he has running through the whole thing, and you follow the rules and everything will be okay. So I have a few of those in here, but I thought the word axiom is way cooler than rules because it has an X in it, so I decided to use that instead. But here's the first one. That feature that you have, it can be used in a way that you didn't think of. Try and figure out what it is. And this came from one of the first attacks that happened, first large attacks that happened at Facebook. That wasn't kind of a low-hanging fruit. It was something that was really innovative, and weird. And it came at a time when we were very focused on growth, and we didn't have a lot of resources, we didn't have a lot of money, we didn't have a lot of people. And it really informed the way that we decided to think about attacking security from then on. And this was in early 2006 when this started. So we had a feature at the time called Friend Finder where you could upload, we'd tell you how to export your email list, you could upload it to us, and we would tell you, here's, of the people that are on your list, here's how many of them have Facebook accounts, so if you join, we'll automatically send out friend requests for you to them and come join all your friends. At that time, we were also very focused on performance because we didn't have a lot of money to buy servers, and we wanted to make sure that every feature we put in, we knew how many CPU cycles it took, we'd monitor them, and where there were inefficiencies, we'd go into the code and try and fix them. So we suddenly found that this page was very, very heavy. Lots of CPU, we were serving it a lot, and we thought there was a problem with it. So we went in and looked at the code, everything was fine. Ended up partitioning off a couple things in a couple servers in production and looking at what people were uploading and looking at what they were doing. And what we found was a variety of IP addresses from around the world were uploading a slightly misformatted file that contained 100 alphabetical email addresses. And they were doing it a lot. So what they were doing ultimately was taking a spam list that they'd gotten of email addresses and scrubbing it via Facebook. So every time we told them, hey, on your list, 50 of those guys have Facebook accounts, they knew those are good addresses, and they could spam them with impunity. And so internally we thought about, what do we do about this? We had probably 4 choices. One was to ignore it, which wasn't good because we were paying for the CPU usage that was not showing real pages to our users. Another one was to try and code around it or to keep them from doing it. But realistically, that's not where we wanted to put our engineering time at that point, and we probably wouldn't succeed because we'd make changes, they'd make changes, the arms race would go on. We could just buy more servers and try and support it, which was obviously the least favorite option. And that really left us with one choice, and that was to go on the offensive and find out who it was, go after them, do whatever we could to get them to stop. And I was a big proponent of that solution. So that's what we did. We ended up using some legal methods that I'll talk about later in the presentation, filed lawsuits against John Doe's because we didn't know who they were, went after a bunch of the IP addresses with discovery letters, subpoenas, and that alone stopped the activity. But we wanted to find out who it was and go after them. Ultimately, after a money trail that went from Washington to Cyprus to Canada, all over the place, we ended up finding the individuals involved, serving them, suing them in U.S. court, even though they were Canadians, and they settled for a few $100,000. The upshot of this was, in retrospect, that it probably cost us $50,000 to do the suit. This was at a time where that was a lot of money for us. We could have bought a lot of servers for that. We could have supported more usage. But the $50,000 we spent there not only stopped the attack, thereby gaining probably $20,000, $30,000 worth of server capacity that we didn't have to rebuy, but ultimately, because of the penalties, we ended up having more revenue to actually support our real business and doing what we wanted to do. So that informed one of our key security values, which is we diligently go after attackers of any type. Anyone attacks Facebook, we'll go after them. We may not do anything. We may just identify them and sit on it for a while, We have 7 years till the statute of limitations runs out, but we want to know who people are who are attacking us and why. The other thing we might do is not just sue them. We actually will probably, if they're really good at it, we'll offer them a job, as some of the people on my team, that's how we found them. Yes, we still do that. It's not a cliche. And we use pretty much all legal means to identify attackers and their motives. So we're big on attribution, Jeff. And that means not only IP addressing and their interactions with Facebook, but once we identify in the whole chain of the attack, as I'll talk about later, we'll go after people in there too and ask them who these people are or who other people are, because ultimately we want to get down to an individual. And then once we find those, if people are continuing to attack us, we go after them with both civil and criminal penalties. And I'll talk about some of the things we're able to do based in the U.S. I was trying to get some information on equivalent European laws and other ways that people in Europe could do this, and I wasn't able to, but I'm still working on that because obviously we're going to need that in the future as well. And then Facebook has a set of corporate values that are pretty strange. I was going to go through all of them, and I thought that's not really appropriate here, but there's 3 in particular that are actually really relevant to the security organization. We respect the trust that users place in us, and that's pretty much first and foremost. I think from the day that I started at Facebook, and a value that I've tried to instill in the whole group is we're essentially a private security force for the 400 million people that use the site. And we need to think and act that way, that we're protecting your self-interest. And in a sense, your interests are our interests because we want you to use the site and we want you to be safe on using it. So we work hard at that. Secondly, the company moves very fast. And by very fast, pretty much every company, every person I talk to who's been in what they think is a fast development organization, I tell them what we do and how we do it, and they realize that they're somewhat slow by comparison. We, in the early days, we were pushing code once or twice a day. We did that probably through late 06, and then we slowed down to once a day, and now we're averaging about once a week. But these are major changes, major develops, and so we're constantly refactoring, which means there's a lot of other tools that you have to follow. Our tools we have to keep updated, things like that. But also our attackers move fast, so we have to move fast enough to keep up with them and not let them lap us. And what's very important at Facebook is, since our resources are so small, we're still only about a 1,200 person company, and everyone has to work very hard, but it's very important that when you're working hard that you're leveraging that work on high order problems. And I'll talk about one of the ways that we think in security where the high order problems are and how to go after them. And then it's very important to us to work in the community and talk to everyone about what we're doing and how. And we want to assist the community as much as they assist us, and there's a bunch of ways that we do that. And one of them is the responsible disclosure policy that we have, which is if you find a security issue, or you're a researcher, you're a user, or anything, and you come to us and tell us about it before you tell anyone else and give us a chance to work on it, we'll not only give you credit for it on our security pages, which is facebook.com/security, but we'll also indemnify you from the normal actions that we would take against other people. So we won't sue you for it. We won't report you to law enforcement. And if it's a really good hack, we'll probably end up hiring you. Okay, here's another rule. And this is, you're going to hear me say this word about, 50 times in the next half hour. Intelligence is king. You own the playing field. Your application, your website, your network. Do everything you can to get every single piece of information out of there, not just the obvious pieces of information. Just get as much data as you can and then figure out different ways to analyze it to make attributions. It's amazing how easy it is to attribute attacks to at least unknown actors, but identify the individuals if you look at the data appropriately. So this one I'm going to actually leave out for a little bit because I think it's really, really important. Okay. This is a little bit about how the team was built out. I just wanted to kind of show the scale and the kind of challenges that we had. When I built out the team, I had two tracks. One was our security and incident response team, and the other was the law enforcement response team. And those are the people who law enforcement comes to with subpoenas, warrants, and asks for data, and we give it to them. And this is, I haven't found any other company that's really done it this way yet. But the reason we did it this way, because usually the law enforcement team are under legal, under lawyers. They're treated as compliance, not really as security. The reason we did it this way is I thought the security and incident response team is going to proactively look on our site and find what people are doing, try and figure out what the underground economy is around us, disrupt it that way. But we can also gain a lot of information about what criminals are doing on the site because the police are going to come and tell us every time they give us a warrant or a subpoena. And putting those two pieces of information, those two information collection mechanisms together has actually produced wonderful results. And the tools that we build, we can simultaneously build for both teams. So the same tools that they might use to respond to a warrant request or a subpoena request, we can use internally to investigate attacks and incidents. And the less than 50 million number is, that was about the number of users before we started building out this team. Until that point, each of these boxes represented one person. So we had about 3 people doing this job. As we've gotten greater than 50 million, we built out, and we split the security and incident response team into 3 separate silos. Malware does pretty much what you expect it does, is we go and get malware that targets us, we reverse engineer it, we analyze it, we run it in boxes. If they're bots, we try and get into the command and control network to see what they're doing, all that kind of stuff. Investigation is pretty much what you expect. It's developing cases against people, looking at attacks, analyzing what they're doing, and trying to figure out how to circumvent them. And intelligence is in the middle because it is a little bit in the middle. It's not only analyzing the attacks that people are doing against us, but looking at the whole value chain. How is someone able to pull off this attack? What is their ultimate goal? How does the community feel about us? Are they afraid of us? Are they not? Are people planning attacks? Is someone shopping around for a particular script? That's what we do in intelligence. I have some great stories there, but you have to hit me up later to see if you can get them out of me. So this is a big one that I used also from the very beginning, is compliance isn't security. And I'm going to call out PCI as one spec, but everyone knows there's a lot more specs. And a lot of organizations, I think, will have a security organization that comes in and really views the world from an information security perspective. So they're going to have a spec. They want policies around it. They're going to implement password controls and IT access controls and things of that nature. But really, from the outside world, the real threats that we faced, and maybe your organization is going to face, those don't really do anything. You can be fully PCI compliant and still get hacked, as has been proven many, many times. So when you're small and you're moving fast and you have a lot of very dynamic attacks against you, in my opinion, the time you spend on compliance above and beyond what you absolutely have to is time wasted. Okay. Here's a little bit of a model of how we think about the world. And we'll see how it works. Call this diagram the triangle for obvious reasons. It's going to be a triangle. So the base is vulnerabilities. And the way that we define vulnerabilities is every piece of software, every device, every building, everything really has some mechanism to get in. We all know this. We just maybe don't know what it is yet, but there's a way in or around everything. If I could make the base of the triangle infinite, I would, because that's the way that I think about it. And if you spend time going after every single vulnerability or trying to find every single vulnerability in your network, in your application, in your physical plant, anywhere, you're spending a lot of time going after and trying to categorize an infinite set. Maybe not the most useful time. Threats are, the way we define threats are, there are vulnerabilities that are actually, would be harmful if they were exploited in your environment. So understanding which of the vulnerabilities are important, i.e. threats, versus those that are just there, and prioritizing accordingly is really important. This is hopefully not something that is new to everyone here, because I think that's the way we've all thought about security for a long time. And I think most of the security organization, and especially compliance specifications, really sit in these two layers of the triangle, and they don't go further than that. Because without attacks, threats and vulnerabilities are fine. If you take an XP machine that's unpatched and sit it in a room that no one can get into, and don't worry about the output and have only one person come use it, and you never connect it to the internet or do anything, if you're printing paper off of there, it's probably okay. It's not a huge issue. But as soon as you plug that in to the internet, you have attacks. And especially when you're thinking about the XP boxes being plugged in on the internet, it's almost as if we think about it as a force of nature, that you plug the box in and automatically attacks are going to come, and eventually the box will get owned, and that's kind of just the way it is. So the way to approach that is be very strong at the level between threats and attacks. Harden that so that you can be attacked without the box getting owned. You can fight off those attacks. I think that's valuable, and obviously you want to do that at a lot of layers. But if you have the most leveraged way to attack attacks is that there are people behind them. They're not forces of nature. Every one of those attacks comes from someone who has an agenda, a motive, something that they want to do. And if you go after them, a few of them, you'll reduce the people that are specifically targeting you. And that's what we decided to do. Oh, I skipped ahead, actually. I was talking about things that were in future slides. Anyway, I think a lot of people focus on threats and vulnerabilities, especially in compliance. Attacks are a great place to understand how those things are important and then go after the actors. What a wonderful slide. Okay. So the way that we really dealt with this is, and this is pretty much our policy still, is we don't pay attention to the vulnerabilities. We keep track of them in terms of knowing what's out there and knowing what's relevant so that we can assess what's a threat or not. But if we see that there's something on any of the millions of lists, or we hear it from any of our vendors that this is relevant to us, we're not automatically going to go patch that thing. We're going to do a threat assessment first. And those threat assessments are really based on overall in the company what's important. And what's important to us is protecting user data, keeping the site running, and making people feel secure with putting their data up. So if there's a threat that's going to, say, address something that's not necessarily related to the production website, it's internal, and we don't think that there's any way it's going to, if it was compromised that would access user data, we're probably not going to get to that one right away. The really important thing to us, though, is watching attacks and identifying attacks, because if someone's attacking you, that's really the best mechanism you have for identifying who they are and going after them. You can ultimately expand that, as I'll talk about in a later slide, to other mechanisms to identify them. But at the point when they're attacking you, you have a bunch of data that you can, if you build a site correctly, a bunch of data that you can get that will help you identify and attribute that person. Even if you don't necessarily know who they are in the real world, you can collate attacks that are later attributable to someone. And then go after the actors. The way that we decided to do this is everyone has a motive, figure out what the motives are, and frustrate them. So I'm going to talk about spam in a second. Obviously, with spammers, their motive is making money. And if you destroy the economics of spamming for them, they'll leave you alone. And by the way, if you have a judgment for $870 million against someone, you're destroying the economics of spamming for them. So one thing that we're really big on at Facebook also is distributed help. and this has probably actually affected a bunch of people in this room. It's not security related, but it's a philosophical thing. When we decided to translate the site into multiple languages, we realized there's a lot more languages than we have people in the company who speak these languages. How are we going to do it? And the way that we did it is we asked people who were in regions to help us. So if you were in, say, France, where we were starting to see some uptick in the site, we asked people in France, hey, help us translate the site into French. And they'd register as translators. We'd give them a list of all the different strings and say, tell us what you think these are. And what happens at the low end, if you don't have a lot of responses, is people will make jokes and put in all kinds of crazy stuff. But then we feed that back in and ask the next person, hey, here's what we think these are. Are these right? And ultimately what will happen is the users have the same vested interest that you do in your application or your site. They want it to work. They want it to work for them. They want it to be good and valuable and provide value in their life. So they're going to help. And what we found is after a certain threshold of users had gone through, if we'd fed back this information, we'd get accurate translations. And no specific single person did it. It didn't really depend on one person's interpretation of what the language was. It was en masse, the users making a decision. Ask them for help, they'll help you. So we do the same thing with spam. Users report spam, and if enough users report similar pieces, we'll just automatically start taking it out of the system. And the way we talk about spam and what it are these things. Some of them are a little more than your traditional email spam. I mean, clearly there is your traditional email classic messaging spam with that has text and URLs in it and goes around. But there's other things that we consider spam that are really precursors to that type of spam. Someone making lots and lots of friend requests, people who are going around and kind of cherry picking friends that have large numbers of friends so that they can be able to send messages to friends of friends, things of that nature. And then the whole creating fake accounts or compromising accounts, or even there's been some attempted session hijacking, but they're not very good at it. And we have a lot of automated methods or distributed methods to attack these. Basically, if you engage in a bunch of those behaviors before, we have automated systems that compare your actions to the actions of normal users, the distribution of all the regular people who are using the site and what they do. And as you move further and further away from that set of normal activity, you'll start seeing automated countermeasures. One of them is rate limiting. So for instance, if you're sending a lot of messages, a lot more than a normal user would, we'll start limiting the number of messages you can send by putting in an interstitial page saying you're sending too many messages, slow down. If you continue sending lots of messages because you're not a human reading that page, you're a script, then we'll start taking other methods like throwing in CAPTCHAs or keeping your messages from sending for a much longer period, which destroys the economics of the script because it takes longer for the spam messages to get out, up to and eventually just disabling the account so it can't send any more messages. All of this happens in an automated fashion in real time. And also, if a bunch of individuals become disabled for sending similar messages, we'll start targeting that message as potential spam, and we'll block it automatically and start removing it from the network. And we do that via a bunch of different classifiers, like there's string blocking. If it's the same string, we'll look at it. If the accounts are moving messages around or deleting things, messages from us saying stop doing this, we'll look at that. And we actually have we're working more and more on automated detection of traffic flows as opposed to content flows to do that stuff. So this is all leading up to a big case study, by the way, so that's where we're going here. Because we're in the U.S. and California, we actually have a really good legal arsenal that we can use worldwide, and here's some of the things they are. I'm sorry I don't have any European equivalents, but if you're in the U.S., some of this stuff will work for you. So the first one is the CAN-SPAM Act, which is an anti-spam statute in the U.S., federal statute, that really you could bring our cases to the FBI or other law enforcement agencies, and they could prosecute under this. But the AUSAs aren't really keen on prosecuting this law. They haven't had good luck with it. Fortunately, there's a civil damage, so we can actually, once we find the people involved, even before we find the people involved, we can sue them for sending this type of material. And there's a statutory damage that's as high as $100 per message sent. Interestingly, in the statute, it's per message sent, not message received, which means that, for instance, if our automated systems, which they do, identify the messages as spam and start deleting them before the users ever see them, it's still, under the statute, $100 per message. So someone may make a large spam attack, our systems may catch it, remove it from the system before any user actually even sees the messages, but we still have statutory damages based on the numbers of messages sent. And some of those statutes are pretty high. I'll talk about that during the case study. And we've also got the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, both at the federal level and at the state level, that provides for civil damages for unauthorized access. The statutes don't define what unauthorized access is, which is probably a good piece of legislation because that'll change quicker than the legislation would. But our Statement of Rights and Responsibilities, our Terms of Service, does define what unauthorized access is. And that's a lot of different things. If you're interested, go look at it. I didn't want to go through them all today. Okay, so here is the chain of a typical spam attack on Facebook. And I'm going to talk through the chain. You guys probably have seen some or all of these links before. And then I'm going to discuss different ways that we interdict each section of the chain and then what the result of that type of thing ultimately was. So first off, someone's got to identify an attack. It may or may not rely on a threat or a vulnerability in our application or network. It may just be using the site the way it's supposed to be, sending messages to a bunch of people. But sometimes it does rely on an application layer threat, an application layer vulnerability, something. Someone at some point tries to figure that out, and that's an early warning system that something's going to happen if you start seeing that type of behavior. And I'll explain how we do that. And then they'll generally go collect a lot of accounts. And they either do this by buying big fish lists and just trying them against us to see how many work, or they'll farm friends or some of the other mechanisms I described before on the site. Because of the social nature of Facebook, you can't just send messages to millions of people automatically. You have to have some relationship with them. So you either need to get into compromised accounts that have friends that you can send messages to, or you need to create accounts that people will friend and make a connection to, and then use those to send messages. And then you have to write or buy software to script that, because you're clearly not going to send 100 million messages by hand. So, there are people out there who will identify some way to do this, write software that they'll sell, and there's people who write their own software. Then you do the attack. This is where we get to know about you. You can go through all those previous steps without necessarily coming to our attention, but definitely once you perform the attack, start sending lots of spam, our systems will catch you and they'll alert us to you, and we'll start figuring out who you are and what you're doing. One of the first things we'll check is, where are you sending people? Because generally you're not going to make money by selling things on Facebook. You're going to send people to some other site to install malware, to get them to buy something, what have you. So where are you sending people and how are you getting them there? We'll start investigating that immediately. And then there's profit. At the end, most of the spammers are not collecting information. They're not trying to gather personal information. They're trying to get money. And that's an easy one to go after. So how do we do this stuff? To disrupt the identification of attack, someone's going to be sitting there trying things, trying to figure out how to do it. And early on, we actually caught a lot of people because they weren't really thinking that our users had any money, so they weren't trying to send them off-site, but they were really trying to collect credentials. So a lot of people were putting in CSS attacks and JavaScript rewriting of the page to try and collect usernames and passwords so they could sell elsewhere. One of the ways that we found out about that is we just decided to, at the database level, start monitoring every piece of text that someone entered into the site, stripping out, obviously, JavaScript and SQL and things like that. But then also, since we knew who they were, because they were logged in, or they had been logged in, or we had some mechanism to tie them to some Facebook profile. We also saved that information, and then we started following up with who are the top 10 people who are trying this all the time, or who are the top people who are succeeding at this, where there may be something where we weren't filtering it correctly. And we gained a lot of information that way. That's an example of early detection that you can have on individuals. Some of those individuals that we found, we've never approached. We just identified them internally and then have figured out, oh, these are some of the people who are writing and selling scripts against us. And ultimately, if we need to, we can take action against them. So in the collection of accounts, everyone knows where they get these. It's all phishing. So our intelligence group has gotten into the phishing economy and has done things like seeded bad lists. So we'll just hand out lists of users to people and know that anyone that goes to any of these accounts is getting it off the list because they're not real accounts. And then we start gaining information about what they're trying to do and who's using those accounts. We've also just bought lists and wholesale deactivated all the users on the list, telling them they need to change their passwords so that we invalidate the value of the lists. And we've built some systems that pay a lot of attention to the URL formation or people's interactions with the site. And this is actually one of the benefits of us being such a fast-moving company is that stuff changes all the time. The interface points change, the data changes, the cookies change, everything changes a lot. So if someone writes a piece of software, they're either going to have to invest a ton of time keeping up with all the changes we're making in the site and the interfaces in order to make it continue to look as a real user, or they're not going to, which is more typical of what happens. And then we can start identifying information about, oh, this particular URL that's being called is based on the way we used to call it 3 weeks ago. So this is clearly a script, and it happens to be similar coming from all these different places, so it's probably the same script. Let's start attributing that and figuring out who wrote this and why. It's definitely a benefit of the fact that we move so fast that we're able to do this. I think if you had a less dynamic development environment, you might not be able to get quite as much information out of this as we do. But we're actually pretty able to rapidly identify these people. And then, obviously, when they're performing the attack, the automated systems I talked about earlier kick into play and start automatically identifying attacks and actors and potential individuals who are doing it for us. And the users give us a lot of information about the spam. If a bunch of users report particular messages as spam, again, the automated systems will start clearing it out. I'm kind of rushing here because I'm aware of time and I want to make sure we have a QA session, so apologize for that. So at this point after the attack, when we start seeing messages coming down, we'll definitely go after what the target is. If they're going after malware, we'll go get the malware, we'll reverse engineer it, we'll submit it pretty quickly to antivirus people that we work with. We'll look at what it's trying to do to see if it's something that ultimately targets us again or if it goes after another organization. If it does, we'll talk to the other organization and pass that on to them. And if it's affiliate marketing where they're going to redirection sites or other sites, we'll get those taken down within a couple hours. So the time window for having people see the messages and then react on them is actually very, very small because we're already removing messages by the time we're removing the domains that the messages point to. And then finally there's the money. And recently the Can-Spam Act was modified so that if people are being affiliate marketers and are directing people back to other marketing sites, that the ultimate marketing site is responsible for the actions of the affiliate. And that's been very helpful for us because if we know ultimately they're selling something, we go to the company that's selling it and say, we have evidence that there's statutory spam that you're marketing. If you don't give us information about who you're giving this money to for these particular accounts, we can hold you liable. And they generally are willing to turn over those people pretty quickly. which means even after all of that, the investment of the accounts, the software, the attack, the hiding their tracks and everything, ultimately they're not going to get their check, which is pretty destructive to the economics of spam. And when we find them, they're still going to be liable under the CAN-SPAM Act. So you can't actually read these. Here's some information about different suits that we pursued. We've actually got dozens of these types of suits lined up, and we're just pursuing them kind of at our leisure. This was our first big spam lawsuit. I think this still remains the largest CAN-SPAM judgment ever. The statutory damages on this were about $1.3 billion, and the judge thought that was excessive, so he put it down to a much more reasonable number of $870 million. And this is against an individual who's in Canada. And you may think, well, if you have a U.S. judgment against someone in Canada, that's really not that useful for you. But in fact, it is, because it means that any asset that goes through the United States, we have a claim to. So even if we can't actually go after this person's money in Canada, which there are mechanisms which we could, but even if we can't get the money in Canada, it means that no one in the U.S., no affiliate marketer, no business that he can pay can move money through the U.S. without us being able to attach to it. So it makes the cost of doing business in the U.S. much more prohibitive for him. And I don't think he's been spamming since then. And then recently we got a Sanford Wallace judgment, which was smaller. I think it was only about 700 and something million. We had statutory damages in that case of $7 billion, which the judge also felt was a bit excessive. And he reduced it as much as he could, and where we had multiple counts, he only counted one, and he still ended up with a much more reasonable number of $700 million. In that case also, though, which is interesting, is because the CAN-SPAM Act has both civil and criminal penalties, the judge ordered Mr. Wallace not to interact with Facebook during the trial and to cease any spamming activity as defined by the CAN-SPAM Act, which he didn't do. So there's a pending criminal case against him now because of that, which would be interesting how that comes out. Okay, so yeah, we're doing on time, not well, but we'll still run through it. So what types of things did I just say? We've got the pyramid again of vulnerabilities and threats and attacks and actors. Your highest leverage actions in these points is to go after the actors, in our belief. The vulnerabilities and threats. Vulnerabilities are endless. The threats you keep an eye on because they're important, but don't get mired in them, and really pay most of your attention to the attacks, because that's where you can gather intelligence about. Get your foot in the door as to the whole chain of people attacking you, and then eventually identify the actors and hound them, keep after them, and destroy their economics. But really, I think this slide says it all as to what I think we do and things that may help you, is gather lots and lots of intelligence, disrupt people when they're attacking you, use your laws wherever you can, and be innovative about using them, and don't rely necessarily on law enforcement to take care of all these things for you. Stay out of a compliance mindset, because policies and compliance, while helpful, are not going to help you really defend against the bad guys who you identify and go after or hound them as much as you can, because that's the highest leverage action that you can take against attacks. And ultimately remember that your interests and your users' interests should be aligned, and they are aligned in terms of your security apparatus protecting them. Then finally, after all these axioms, here's one that's really important. Sometimes just do what you have to do and forget the rules, forget the compliance, because the other side doesn't have to comply with anything. They can do whatever they want. And sometimes you're going to have to too. Okay, let's take questions now. Is there any questions? Anything? Yes. One way in the back. Well, I think calling suing hackers a business model isn't actually accurate because we never get the money. It's a deterrent. I kind of didn't hear the first part of the question, so. Introducing more bugs. Well, fortunately, our development process is very good at introducing bugs. It's a not widely touted fact, and one that shocks a lot of people, is that we don't actually have any dedicated QA in the company. We develop and test internally, and the security team makes risk assessments based on what we find. But there's still plenty of bugs there. Yes. I can't really address the revenue number. The question. Let me repeat the question. Yes, the question was how many people do we have dedicated to security, and how much of our total revenue do we dedicate to security? Can't really address the revenue number, and the number of people is actually pretty broad, and depending on how you define security. The core security team, the team that I described in the org chart there, is now about I think 20 some odd people out of 1,200. But we also have other organizations that have security responsibility that work with us. So we have a site integrity team that sits inside engineering and builds and maintains those automated systems I was discussing. And that's another, I think, 10 or 15 people right now. And then we also have our user operations team who part of their role is to respond to user requests for not just spam, but any other type of legal or illegal activity that may be reported, and to move that into the security chain. And that's about 200 some odd people. So if you take all those responsibilities together, you're talking somewhere, say 20% of the company is working on a security-related, directly working on some sort of security-related function. And we have strong security awareness throughout our whole development organization as well, which is about half the company. Yeah, well, I'll go with him first, and then you're next. Yes?
What do you use today that's on CDN, outsourced, you might not full service? Do you get reach out to your providers and get most back before they have most from your system?
The question was, a lot of our user data sits on the CDN, the content distribution networks, and do we get back logs from those as part of our intelligence gathering and correlate that with our own logs? And the answer is we have. So where we're investigating things, and we want to see if content is moving out through the CDN that we're not seeing directly, we absolutely will go to them and get logs. And we've actually, that was part of our original agreement with them when we first started using that. So we have that capability, yes. The question was, how is the relationship between our group and the Facebook management and CEO? The company is still very small, and it was very, very small when I started as well. So there's been an awareness of security early on at the highest levels of management. The relationship and direction is, I would say it's good. We definitely inform regularly to the management team about different attacks, different threats, and different, especially large, actionable investigations that are underway. That happens on a regular basis. I think that's the best way to describe it. Is they're engaged, they know what we're doing. Okay, yes. Yeah, the question is, are we doing anything about advertising, and especially advertising through platforms or third-party networks? And the answer is yes, we are doing things. Our advertising strategy is evolving very quickly right now, especially in terms of platform and figuring out what we're doing there and how. And in fact, next week is our developers conference in San Francisco, where we'll be talking more about advertising and how to integrate those inside of applications. We have some things, some measures in place to, especially for third-party ad networks, to identify the ad and try and find malicious ones, of which there have been some, but also our own ads and the ad networks that we work with are very responsive in terms of removing that content quickly and helping us identify the people behind it. Anything else? No? Nothing, really? Well, is there one? Oh, hello. The question is, since we're using U.S. law to go after attacks, if someone's in a foreign country, are they free to attack Facebook? And the answer is actually no. The law and the way it's written specifically takes into account, especially the California law, which is very well written, takes into account the idea that the actors may not be under the jurisdiction of California, for instance, or the U.S., but that doesn't preclude us using that mechanism to make judgments against them. And the Canadian case is actually a good example. It's a Canadian living in Canada who we sued and got this judgment against. And we actually have mechanisms to, once we have the judgment in the U.S., to go to other countries and have the country recognize the judgment. Some countries have treaties where they'll do that. But also in other cases where we don't have a treaty, where, your example of Brazil or China is probably applicable, they're not the entire that person that we end up suing is not the entire economic chain. They need to get their money from somewhere. They need to move their money somewhere. And, I don't see a lot of spammers that are interested in getting paid in reals. They're interested in getting paid in dollars or euros. And there's plenty of opportunity for a judgment that's under these acts to go after those assets. Yes? The question was, am I also involved in the privacy discussion? Me personally, or the team? The privacy discussions going on worldwide around Facebook. And the answer is absolutely yes, because security and privacy on Facebook are very strongly intertwined. We can't offer people privacy around their personal information and control of it unless we have the security measures in place that allow them to do that. So we definitely engage our privacy discussions with an element of security, and our security discussions are also informed by our respect of our users' privacy. Did that answer the question? Kind of. Well, is there more? I mean,
it's the whole notion of sharing data with other parties is not very nice. And it's part of the business case, obviously, but it's not what any security expert or professional should actually support. Giving away data without letting people know, or even letting them know somewhere in a 7-point character, gray and white.
I think the follow-on point, we can actually talk more about this. The follow-on point was that sharing data, which is potentially part of a business model of a social networking site, is not something that a security professional should support. And I think that the role of a security professional is to think about how to do things in a manner that is safe and respectful of the users. And I think we have a lot of stuff to do with it, but I'm not prepared to talk about that up here right now. But we can talk about more about that later. Yes.
So, what are the biggest security risks that Facebook faces?
The biggest security. Yeah, I love this question. The biggest security risks that Facebook faces or will face, and what keeps me up at night. I think, by and large, our biggest most disastrous event would be a wholesale loss of user data, a breach there. That doesn't actually keep me up at night because I think we're very well prepared and we have good mechanisms in place to keep that from happening. The types of attacks and the type of threats that I think do keep me up at night are threats that are intrinsic to the social network of the site. And I actually debated whether to talk about the 419 type of scams today and decided not to because of the numerous ongoing investigations that we have. But I think that that's a threat where the implicit trust that people put in the network is then turned around and used against them. And figuring out how to manage that trust appropriately so that people still trust, but at the same time kind of don't trust what we're telling them is going to be a challenge for us. But so far it seems to be working pretty well based on anecdotal evidence that we have. Okay. Thank you very much. I hope it was useful, and thanks again.